In the year 550 BC, a series of events in what is now southwestern Iran altered the political landscape of the ancient world for generations to come. Cyrus II, the ambitious ruler of the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, challenged his overlord and grandfather, the Median king Astyages, for dominance over what many historians refer to as the Median Empire. The Babylonian text, known as the Nabonidus Chronicle, records what happened next. Astyages called up his armed forces and went against Cyrus, the king of Anshan, for purposes of conquest. As for Astyages, his army rebelled against him, and he was taken into custody. They presented him to Cyrus. Cyrus went to the land of Ecbatana, the royal city, and silver, gold, goods, and property, which he carried away as spoils from Ecbatana, he took to Anshan. This made Cyrus the ruler of a vast domain that stretched from the mountains of western Afghanistan to the Halys, or modern Kizilirmak River, in central Turkey. We called this state the Achaemenid Persian Empire, named after the dynasty's legendary ancestor, Hakamanich, who the Greeks called Achaemenes. Cyrus would later be immortalized in history as Cyrus the Great. His original name in the Old Persian language is Kurush. The Greeks called him Kyros. Cyrus, which is derived from Kyros, is the Latinized version of the name and its most popular form today, which is why I'll continue to use it for the rest of this program. The Persians and Medes shared deep cultural, linguistic, and religious ties, making them so closely connected that many later Greek writers often use the term Mede interchangeably with Persian. These similarities likely eased the integration of the Medes into the Achaemenid Empire following Cyrus's conquest, and gave them a status within the realm second only to that of the Persians. For the rulers of the two powerful kingdoms to the west, Lydia and Babylon, Cyrus's rapid rise was both alarming but also an opportunity to expand their own domains. Neither Croesus of Lydia or Nabonidus of Babylon recognized Cyrus as the legitimate king of Media, and they had valid reasons for this. Both kingdoms had peace treaties and marriage alliances with the Median royal family. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Croesus' sister was married to Astyages, while other classical sources claim that the great Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, had married Astyages' sister, Amytis of Media. Although no contemporary archaeological evidence has confirmed either marriage, these alliances may have been what kept the region at peace for over 3 decades. That is, until 550 BC, when Cyrus overthrew Astyages. As Cyrus may have been seen as a usurper against their relative, both Croesus and Nabonidus likely felt justified in attempting to seize territory from the Persian upstart. Croesus of Lydia was the first to act. In 547 BC, he led his army across the Halys River to capture the former Median fortress of Praetoria in present-day Cappadocia. He believed that Cyrus, the new, untested ruler of such a large domain, wouldn't retaliate. He was wrong. Cyrus accepted the challenge and led his troops on a swift 1,200-mile march to Praetoria within months. There, the Persian and Lydian armies fought a brutal battle that ended in a stalemate. Realizing that his forces were outnumbered, Croesus retreated to his capital of Sardis with plans to renew the campaign the following year with the support of his Babylonian and Egyptian allies. However, shortly after arriving in Sardis and disbanding his troops, Croesus was informed that Cyrus and the Persian army had been stealthily in close pursuit. The Lydians were completely taken by surprise when they saw the Persian army emerge on the horizon, and they hastily assembled to defend Sardis. Herodotus, our main source for the events of this war, recounts that a battle ensued, followed by a Persian siege of Sardis. Eventually, the Persians were able to scale the walls and open Sardis's gates, which resulted in the Lydians' defeat and the surrender of the city and Croesus's kingdom, which just happened to include many predominantly Greek-speaking city-states in Western Asia Minor and the Aegean, most of which were part of the area referred to in antiquity as Ionia. This region was called Ionia because much of it had been colonized by Greek speakers of the Ionian dialect after 750 BC. By the 6th century BC, Ionia had fallen under the control of the Kingdom of Lydia, and after the fall of Sardis to Cyrus the Great in 546 BC, the region was absorbed into the Persian Empire. Other colonies on the southern shores of the Black Sea would also eventually submit to Persian rule. To the west of Ionia were the many independent city-states of the Cycladic Islands and mainland Greece. For the most part, the Greek-speaking peoples on both sides of the Aegean shared a common culture, language, and ties of kinship. Whether they liked it or not, they were now also entangled within the political and economic web of the Persian Empire. Within a decade of Lydia's fall, the great city of Babylon, heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, also succumbed to Cyrus the Great and his expanding Persian Empire. In 525 BC, 5 years after Cyrus's death, Egypt fell to his son and successor, Cambyses II. In just under 3 decades, all of the great Near Eastern kingdoms were under the banner of the great Persian king of the Achaemenid Empire, whose capital by then had moved from Anshan to Pasargadae in southwestern Iran. Unlike many of the empire builders who had come before them, Cyrus and most other Achaemenid rulers were generally tolerant of the cultural and religious practices of their subject peoples, and in most cases, their previous forms of local government were left intact. As long as they paid their taxes and provided soldiers to augment the great king's army when required, subjects of the Achaemenids could rule themselves locally as they wished, though under the supervision of a regional governor or satrap. This pragmatic policy allowed the Persians to manage a vast, multi-ethnic empire, which at the time was the largest and wealthiest that the world up until then had ever seen. However, the Greek city-states of Ionia often posed a challenge to this approach. Like their mainland counterparts, the Ionians were divided into factions and had diverse forms of government. Oligarchies, tyrannies, and a few with some democratic elements that encouraged a relatively high level of citizen participation. Such diversity, though, led to frequent violence and instability due to the volatile nature of Greek politics. This was something that the Persians could not tolerate because of the potential to destabilize their frontier. To maintain order, the great king and his governors appointed and supported local aristocrats and tyrants who were loyal to them, but not necessarily popular with the locals. Political struggles in the ancient Greek world often pitted powerful oligarchic families against those advocating for a more inclusive government. In such a contentious environment, ambitious aristocrats exploited divisions to seize power as absolute rulers known as tyrants, though their regimes, and often their lives, were typically short-lived. To prolong both, tyrants frequently sought allies to bolster their position against their numerous adversaries. As the Persian Empire became the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean and Aegean, many Greek politicians and aspiring tyrants sought the great king's support to defeat their rivals. Those who were unsuccessful or kicked out of power often could find asylum within the Persian Empire itself. For example, in 510 BC, when the tyrant Hippias was exiled from Athens, he sought refuge at the court of King Darius I. Another was Demaratus of Sparta, who ended up serving as an advisor to Darius' successor, Xerxes. But it was not just political asylum that some Greeks sought amongst the Persians, but also economic opportunities and access to the markets of the East. The Persian Empire opened up new avenues for Greek goods and services. Persian kings and their satraps provided patronage for skilled workers such as architects, stonemasons, craftsmen, engineers, gardeners, artisans, physicians, and soldiers who served as mercenaries and were paid with food and funds from the royal treasury. A few short Greek inscriptions have been found amongst the stone quarries near the Persian ceremonial capital of Persepolis. One of them reads, "This belongs to Pytharchus, dedicated to the gods. Nico carved this." Other evidence of Greek workers within the Persian Empire comes from the archives of Persepolis. One administrative tablet dating to the spring of 499 BC details rations for 23 Ionian Greek women who were working in the capital. It reads, 320 liters of grain provided by Ashpashuptis. Sheda, the agent for special rations, whose allotment is determined by Abeteia, received it at Persepolis and gave it as extra childbirth rations to Ionian women working on the irrigation channels at Persepolis. Their allotment are determined by Abeteia and Miss Shabada. 9 women who gave birth to sons received 20 liters each. 14 women who gave birth to daughters received 10 liters each. During the first decades of Achaemenid rule, there seems to have been little friction between the Ionian Greeks and their new rulers, who had essentially traded one overlord, Croesus of Lydia, for another in Cyrus of Persia. Some city-states may have even fared better under Persian rule. For example, Cyrus's new terms gave the important Greek city of Miletus an even greater deal of political autonomy and more special trading privileges than it had enjoyed under the Lydians. For the most part, these cities on the Persian Empire's periphery were largely left alone during the rest of Cyrus's reign, as well as that of his son and successor, Cambyses II, who was more focused on expanding the empire's borders into Egypt than tightening his grip over Ionia and the Aegean. This, though, would all change during the reign of Darius I. In Old Persian, his name is Daryavaush, from which the Greek version, Dareios, as well as the Latin and more common Darius, are derived from. During his reign, the Persian Empire expanded in all directions, including westward towards Greece. Darius conquered parts of Thrace, secured the kingdom of Macedon as a vassal, and added several islands of the Aegean into the realm. These operations had significant consequences for the relationship between the Persians and the Ionian Greeks, who, due to their location, were increasingly required to contribute more to the royal treasury, troops for the army, and ships for the Persian navy. At the same time, growing discontent spread in Ionian cities as repressive and unpopular Persian-backed tyrants tightened their grips on power. Before we continue further, I'd like to say a bit about Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the Greco-Persian Wars' primary historian. Herodotus chronicled many of the events leading up to and including the war in a series of 9 books called Historia, which most of us know today as histories, or the history. In the beginning of his monumental work, he tells us why Historia was written. Herodotus of Halicarnassus presents this Historia to ensure that the events of mankind should not fade in memory over time, and that the great and marvelous deeds performed by Hellenes and barbarians alike should not go unsung. and, additionally, to explain the cause of the war that they fought against each other. Herodotus has both loyal fans and harsh critics. The great Roman statesman and orator Cicero called Herodotus the father of history, while the esteemed historian and biographer Plutarch dismissed him as a fabricator of lies, and even wrote a short book about him entitled On the Malice of Herodotus. While Herodotus can generally be trusted for the war's overall chronology of events, his narratives should not always be taken literally. Historia was not just a historical record, but also a work designed to entertain, featuring vivid characters and moral lessons tailored for a primarily Greek, and especially Athenian audience. To keep their attention, he couldn't simply just deliver a dry chronicle of events. He had to keep his audience interested and engaged with the stories he told. For this reason, we have to at times take his words with more than just a grain of salt, sometimes a pound. To be fair though, Herodotus' reliability was only as good as the written and human sources available to him, and there are many times throughout histories where he often expresses skepticism or outright disbelief regarding some of the information he reports. Across the Aegean on the Greek mainland, the threat of Persian expansion into Europe was overshadowed by internal political struggles among competing city-states. In 510 BC, the Spartans expelled the Athenian tyrant, Hippias. Once a popular leader, Hippias became a much more repressive and downright cruel tyrant after 514 BC, following the assassination attempt on himself and his brother, Hipparchus. While Hippias escaped death, Hipparchus was murdered. These events transformed Hippias into a cruel ruler who began to impose severe punishments on those who opposed him or were suspected of disloyalty. Such penalties ranged from the confiscation of property to the execution of political opponents. One of Hippias' great enemies were members of the exiled but extremely wealthy Alcmaeonid family. They had tried several times to return to Athens, but without success. Herodotus tells a rather amusing story that eventually, one prominent member of the family, Cleisthenes, used his influence and wealth to bribe the Pythia at the Oracle of Delphi to reportedly tell any Spartans that went there that they must liberate Athens from Hippias' cruelty. Eventually, the Spartan king, Cleomenes, did come with an army to depose Hippias and force him into exile. It's a fun story, but what most scholars believe likely happened is that Cleisthenes may have persuaded King Cleomenes of Sparta to oust Hippias. The Spartan king may have agreed on the condition that in a post-Hippias Athens, the city and its new leadership would distance itself from Sparta's arch-enemy, Argos. The regime change in Athens, though, didn't turn out the way that Cleomenes had intended. Cleisthenes and the Alcmaeonids did return to Athens, but soon afterwards, Cleisthenes found himself in a political struggle with another Athenian aristocrat, Isagoras, son of Tesandros. The two competed for the position of archon, which means ruler, but in Cleisthenes' day was a title given to the chief magistrate of a polis, and in Athens, the highest political position that one could hold. In the end, most Athenian aristocrats sided with Isagoras, and he became archon. In histories, Herodotus describes the situation. Although Athens had been a great city before, it became even greater once rid of its tyrants. There were at that time two powerful men in Athens, Cleisthenes, an Alcmaeonid who was said to have bribed the Pythia, and Isagoras, son of Tesandros, a man from a distinguished house. These two men competed for power, and when Cleisthenes found he was facing defeat, he enlisted the common people into his association of supporters. We're told that Cleisthenes began a series of democratic reforms that started with abolishing the 4 traditional Athenian tribes, and then reassigning all citizens, based on where they lived, to one of 10 new tribes that he established. He then set up a council of 500 that consisted of 50 citizens randomly chosen from each of the 10 tribes. These councilors served for a single year, during which they met daily to supervise state officials and prepare motions for the assembly, whose membership now included all free adult male citizens. With each assembly member having a vote, Athens became the most democratic polis in the Greek-speaking world. This was not what Cleomenes had wanted. His hope was that Athens would return to a more conservative government friendly towards Spartan interests. Instead of a pro-Spartan oligarchy, he got an anti-Spartan democracy. Despite the fact that Cleisthenes was himself the scion of one of Athens' leading aristocratic families, his democratization of the government had made him much more popular with the average Athenian citizen. Isagoras, though, was determined to outdo his rival at any cost, and so he asked Cleomenes of Sparta to intervene in Athenian politics once again, but this time on his behalf. The two knew each other well, as Cleomenes had once stayed with Isagoras when he had come to Athens a few years earlier to overthrow Hippias. There was even a rumor that Cleomenes had been intimate with Isagoras' wife. This, though, didn't matter to Isagoras, as he wanted Cleisthenes and his supporters to be gone, and Cleomenes was the only man he deemed up to the task. Herodotus tells us, while Cleomenes was sending the herald to cast out Cleisthenes and all those who were accursed, Cleisthenes retired from the city on his own accord. Nonetheless, Cleomenes marched to Athens with a small force, and, upon his arrival, endeavored to drive out the pollution by banishing the 700 Athenian households that had been specified by Isagoras. Having accomplished this, he next attempted to dissolve the council and to place power in the hands of 300 partisans of Isagoras. But when the council refused to obey and resisted this measure, Cleomenes and Isagoras, with his partisans, seized the Acropolis. The rest of the Athenians united in their resolve and besieged them for 2 days. On the 3rd day, all the Lacedaemonians departed from the place under a truce. The Lacedaemonians, i.e. the Spartans, may have left in peace, but the Athenians killed any non-Spartans that they caught. On his way back to the Peloponnese, Cleomenes left Isagoras in Eleusis, on the western border of Attica. The departure of the Spartans made it safe for Cleisthenes and his supporters to return home, at least for the time being. Their fear, though, was that Cleomenes would eventually return with a much larger army that would include men from his Peloponnesian allies, of which there were many. In contrast, the Athenians could realistically rely only on the support of the polis of Plataea, which would not be nearly enough to withstand any future Spartan offensive. Other potential allies, such as Eretria, Naxos, Thebes, and Thessaly, had all been previously allied with Hippias, and so they couldn't be trusted. Thus, if Cleomenes and Isagoras returned, Cleisthenes and his supporters would be forced to go into exile yet again, or worse. But there was one state, or rather superpower, that might have been willing to ally and protect Athens from its enemies: the Achaemenid Persian Empire of the great King of Kings, Darius I. And so, at the end of 507 or early 506 BC, the Athenians sent an envoy to the Persian satrap of Lydia in Sardis, Artaphernes, who was also Darius's brother. Herodotus describes the encounter. When the envoys arrived in Sardis and spoke according to their instructions, Artaphernes, son of Hystaspes, the governor of Sardis, inquired who were these people who asked to become allies of the Persians, and where in the world did they live. When he had heard the answer from the envoys, he gave them the brief answer that if the Athenians offered earth and water to King Darius, they would have their alliance. But if they did not do so, he ordered them to leave. The envoys, wanting to bring about the alliance, took the responsibility on themselves and consented to offering earth and water, for which they faced serious charges when they returned to their own land. Offering earth and water was a symbolic gesture of submission to Persian rule, and represented the surrender of a nation's land and everything within it to the great king, which is how the Greeks referred to the Persian emperor. Such a custom is described only by Herodotus, and to date, no archaeological evidence has ever been found to corroborate that such an act ever took place. However, the ancient Persians, and especially the Achaemenids, were well known for their love of gardening, with the king being viewed as the master gardener of the state. Thus, offering earth and water may have symbolized that a nation or city was giving up its land to be cared for by the great king himself. The Athenian delegation may have secured an alliance with the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, but at what cost? Why would the great king of Persia, or in this case, his satrap Artaphernes in Sardis, entertain the idea of a partnership with the small city-state of Athens? Perhaps it was so the Persian navy could augment their Aegean fleet with Athenian ships and use Athens as a safe port and base to further protect their interests in the region. These offers alone, though, probably wouldn't have been enough to draw the Persians into what was essentially an internal Greek affair. No, the price for Persian aid and protection was submission and vassalage to the great king. While Herodotus doesn't provide details of the Athenian delegation's meeting with Artaphernes, such demands were likely expected. The Athenians may have accepted Persian overlordship out of fear of another Spartan invasion and its consequences for pro-democracy factions and opponents of Isagoras. As the Athenians had feared, in the spring of 506 BC, Cleomenes and the Spartans marched west into Attica, this time with a much larger force comprised of men from all over the Peloponnese. But they were not alone, for while they approached Attica from the west, their allies from Boeotia and Chalkis attacked the Athenians from the north. The last time Cleomenes was in Athens, he hadn't brought enough men. This time around, he had more than enough. While we don't have the exact numbers for the Spartan alliance, scholars are certain that the Athenians were hopelessly outnumbered, and they were being attacked on at least two fronts. The nightmare scenario they had feared was now a reality. With limited men and arms, the Athenians focused on one front and chose to face the Spartans and Peloponnesians in the west. This, unfortunately, would allow the Boeotians and Chalkidians to advance unopposed into northern and eastern Attica. If they ever got out of this war alive, the Athenians might have to settle for ceding territory to both of these adversaries. But then, the unexpected happened. Just as the Athenians and Spartans were about to clash, many of the Peloponnesians suddenly disbanded. Herodotus tells us, but as they were about to engage their forces in battle, the Corinthians, after considering among themselves and concluding that they were becoming involved in unjust acts, were the first to do an about-face and leave. And next to leave was Demaratus, son of Ariston, the other king of the Spartans, who had joined Cleomenes in leading the army out of Lacedaemon, and had not disagreed with him before. Scholars have puzzled over these unexplained actions for centuries, and Herodotus offers no details for their cause. What were the unjust acts the Corinthians sought to avoid? And why did Demaratus, Sparta's other king in their dual monarchy system, choose to turn around and head for home? With regard to Corinth, one view is that they may have feared that Sparta was becoming too powerful. After what happened with Cleisthenes following Hippias' overthrow, this time around, Cleomenes would be certain to choose the most compliant tyrant to rule as a Spartan puppet, which would then give Sparta unprecedented influence in both the Peloponnese and Attica. Other members of the Peloponnesian alliance may have feared this as well. But that doesn't explain what might have persuaded Demaratus to withdraw his men and go back to Sparta. Herodotus tells us that Demaratus had not previously been at odds with Cleomenes, and the two would have no doubt discussed the campaign's objectives and strategy before marching on Athens. The Spartans were an extremely religious people, and so if there had all of a sudden been some bad omen or advice from an oracle warning Demaratus not to proceed further, this may have influenced his decision. However, we have no indication from Herodotus or any later historian that this was indeed the case. Some have argued that the Corinthian withdrawal from the campaign may have been a factor, though most scholars believe that their contingent of troops would have amounted to no more than a fifth of the full Peloponnesian force. The Spartans also had the Boeotians and Chalcidians putting pressure on the Athenians from the opposite ends of Attica, so ultimately, a Corinthian withdrawal, while significant, wouldn't have doomed the entire military operation. It's possible that the Athenians weren't as outnumbered as their enemies had initially believed. Remember that just before the attack, the Athenians had sent a delegation to Sardis seeking an alliance with Persia. Herodotus tells us that after offering earth and water, the envoys secured such an agreement with the satrap Artaphernes on behalf of King Darius. Such an alliance would have completely changed the calculus of the war and led the Spartans, Corinthians, and their allies to reconsider their offensive. Confronting the Athenians by themselves may not have been a problem, but the prospect of a Persian intervention likely made the risks of continuing such a war far too great. For if the Persians landed troops on the Greek mainland, then they might not just only defend Athens from attack, but also venture further into the Peloponnese to conquer Corinth, Sparta, and other city-states. Not everyone believes that there ever was such a treaty between the Athenians and Persians. In a historical commentary dating to the 1st century AD, the writer, Aelius Theon, makes a curious reference to the classical historian Theopompus of Chios in the following passage. And by Theopompus in the 25th book of the Philippica, the Greek oath is falsified, which the Athenians say the Greeks swore before the battle of Plataea against the barbarians, as is the treaty of the Athenians with King Darius with the Greeks. As for the Boeotians led by Thebes and the Chalcidians from Evia, they seem to have been quickly defeated by the Athenians shortly after the Spartans and their allies retreated back to the Peloponnese. In Histories, Herodotus summarizes these events as follows. Thus the Athenians joined battle with the Boeotians and decisively overwhelmed them, slaughtering vast numbers and capturing 700 of them alive. Then, on the same day, the Athenians crossed over to Evia and engaged the Chalcidians in battle as well. Winning another victory there, they left behind 4,000 colonists on the land of the horse breeders, which is what the Chalcidian men of substance were called. And all the captives they had taken there, together with the Boeotian captives, they bound in shackles and kept under guard. After the failed campaign, the deposed tyrant Hippias appeared in Sparta, and while there was some discussion of possibly reinstating him in Athens, the proposal didn't win the approval of Sparta's allies. Without any friends who would fight for him in Greece, Hippias went to the city of Sagaeon in the Troad, where his half-brother ruled as tyrant on behalf of the Persians. Though stuck for the time being in Asia, Hippias had only one thing on his mind: to become Athens' ruler once again. Herodotus tells us, when Hippias returned to Asia from Lacedaemon, he missed no opportunity to slander the Athenians to Artaphernes, and did all he could to bring about Athens' submission to himself and Darius. The Athenians found out what Hippias was doing and sent messengers to Sardis to dissuade the Persians from giving credence to exiles from Athens. But Artaphernes ordered them to take Hippias back if they wished to remain secure. The Athenians, however, when this command was reported to them, refused to consent to it, and by this refusal, their posture as enemies of the Persians became public. Sometime in 499 BC, a certain Aristagoras, the ex-tyrant of the city of Miletus, arrived in Sparta. He had previously fallen out of favor with Artaphernes for promising to bring the Cycladic island of Naxos under Persian control. According to Herodotus, the story goes like this. Certain men of substance who were exiled from Naxos by the people had fled to Miletus. Now, the man actually in charge of Miletus at this time was Aristagoras, son of Molpagoras. They asked Aristagoras if he could somehow provide them with the forces they would need in order to return to their homeland. And Aristagoras, thinking that he would obtain the rule over Naxos if the exiles succeeded in returning through his help, presented them with the following proposal. I myself do not have the power to provide you with a force great enough to restore you to your city against the will of the Naxians who now control it, but I shall devote all my energy to solving your problem. Aristagoras then went to Sardis to convince Artaphernes to fund an expedition to conquer Naxos. He described Naxos to Artaphernes as a fertile island with abundant wealth and many slaves, telling him, I have a large sum of money ready for you in addition to the expenses of the army, since it is only right that we, who are taking you there, should furnish such funds. Further, you will acquire other islands to add to the territories of the king, not only Naxos itself, but the islands connected with it, Paros, Andros, and others called the Cyclades. And from there, you would be in a good position to attack Evia, a large and prosperous island no smaller than Cyprus, which you could conquer with little effort. Intrigued by Aristagoras' proposal, Artaphernes, with Darius' approval, provided a fleet of 200 ships and troops under the command of the Persian admiral Megabates. Initially, everything seemed promising, but the two soon quarreled when Aristagoras released a guest friend whom Megabates had tied up. Herodotus then tells us that Megabates completely lost his temper at Aristagoras when he learned about this, but Aristagoras said to him, What business is this of yours? Were you not sent by Artaphernes to obey me and to sail wherever I order you to go? Why are you being such a troublemaker? This response by Aristagoras aggravated Megabates so much that after fuming over it until nightfall, he sent some men by boat to Naxos to reveal to the Naxians the news of the impending assault against them. Warned of the attack, the Naxians prepared for a siege that lasted 4 months. Eventually, the Persians ran out of supplies, and Aristagoras out of money. Realizing that they couldn't take Naxos, the Persian troops and their commander withdrew. Devastated, Aristagoras feared the consequences his failure would bring to both himself and Miletus. Herodotus explains. And so, Aristagoras failed to fulfill his promise to Artaphernes, and at the same time, the costs of the expedition had pressed him hard financially. Moreover, he also feared that because of the army's lack of success and the accusations of Megabatis, his absolute rule over Miletus would be taken from him. Plagued with anxiety, he began to plan a revolt, step by step. According to Herodotus, Aristagoras knew that he couldn't challenge the Persian Empire on his own, and so he traveled to Sparta to persuade King Cleomenes to help him protect Miletus and liberate Ionia from Persian rule. However, when Cleomenes learned that the great king's residence at Susa was a 3-month march away from the Ionian coast, he balked at the request and promptly dismissed Aristagoras. Aristagoras then went to Athens to make his case. In front of the Athenian assembly, he spoke of how easily the Persians could be defeated and the duty the Athenians had to protect their fellow Ionian kin. Herodotus tells us just how persuasive he was. There was nothing he failed to promise them, since he was now in dire need, and at last he managed to win them over. For it would seem to be easier to deceive and impose upon a whole throng of people than to do so to just one individual, since he had failed with Cleomenes of Lacedaemon, who was alone, but then succeeded with 30,000 Athenians. After the Athenians had been won over, they voted to dispatch 20 ships to help the Ionians and appointed Melanthion, a man of the city who was distinguished in every respect, as commander over them. These ships turned out to be the beginning of evils for both Hellenes and barbarians. In antiquity, the term Hellene was used by the Greeks to distinguish themselves culturally and ethnically from non-Greeks, whom they referred to as barbarians. It encompasses not just those from the Greek mainland, but also people from Greek city-states and colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, including Asia Minor, southern Italy, Sicily, and northern Africa. Hellene is derived from the word Hellas, which is the Greek name for Greece. The Athenians could not have foreseen that sending a mere 20 ships to the Ionian coast would ignite a chain reaction that would ultimately engulf much of the Aegean world. Had they known the far-reaching consequences of their actions, both for themselves and for Hellas, they may have reconsidered getting involved in Ionian politics and antagonizing the Achaemenids. How different the course of history might have been had those ships never set sail. But in 499 BC, they, along with others from the city-state of Eretria, set course for Miletus to aid their cousins in Ionia. The Ionian Revolt had begun. Herodotus' stories are undoubtedly entertaining, but they pose challenges for modern historians, often because he emphasizes personal motivations or vendettas as the primary causes of conflicts, while neglecting broader, more objective factors. For example, the Ionians may have revolted more due to economic reasons or dissatisfaction with their local tyrants than the failure of Aristagoras' relationships with characters such as Artaphernes and Megabatis. However, since Herodotus remains our best source on the subject, historians have to rely on his account of events, though with a critical eye. Whether or not the details of Herodotus' story about Aristagoras and the origins of the Ionian Revolt are accurate, Athens and the city-state of Eretria did send men and supplies to support the uprisings in Ionia. Beyond sympathizing with their fellow Ionian Greeks, both city-states likely saw Persian expansion westward as a threat and sought to hinder its advance. The Athenians provided 20 ships, and the Eretrians 5. Herodotus' version of events goes as follows. When the Athenians, the Eretrians, and the rest of the allies had arrived and were present in Miletus, Aristagoras organized an expedition against Sardis. He himself did not accompany the troops, but stayed in Miletus. With this army, the Ionians came first to Ephesus, from where, after leaving their boats at Charissos, they journeyed inland in massive force, with the Ephesians as their guides. They traveled along the Caister River, crossed over Mount Tmolus, and came to Sardis, where they captured the city without resistance from anyone whatsoever. They took control of everything there except for the Acropolis, for Artaphernes himself defended the Acropolis with a rather large force of men. Herodotus suggests that the Persians were caught off guard by the audacious attack on one of the empire's key provincial capitals. The reason for their apparent unpreparedness is unclear, though it's possible that the majority of Persian forces, typically stationed near Sardis, were engaged in other campaigns. However, it didn't take long for the Persians and Lydians on the Acropolis to regroup and prepare for a counterattack. Herodotus describes what happened next. So at the Pactolus River in the Agora, the Lydians and Persians crowded together and were compelled to act in their own defense. When the Ionians saw some of them attempting to defend themselves, and others in great numbers approaching as in an assault, they withdrew in fear to Mount Tmolus, and then, under the cover of night, left for their ships. Along with many houses, the Ionian coalition set ablaze Sardis' great temple dedicated to the goddess Kybele. Persian forces pursued the Ionians to Ephesus, where, according to Herodotus, many Ionian Greeks were slain. When the Persians who dwelled in the districts west of the Halys River heard about these events, they gathered together and rushed to the aid of the Lydians. Discovering that the Ionians were not in Sardis any longer, they followed their tracks and caught up with them at Ephesus. The Ionians deployed their troops to oppose them, but in the battle that followed, they suffered a severe defeat. Many of them were slaughtered by the Persians, including several famous men. Those who escaped from the battle dispersed, as each one fled to his own city. After this, the Athenians returned home, and as far as we know, didn't rejoin the fighting for the next several years, though they may have continued to supply Miletus and other Ionian cities with weapons. It's unclear whether the Eretrians did the same. The Ionians, however, pressed on, and by 497 BC, Byzantium and other cities near the northern Hellespont, along with those in Caria and several on Cyprus, had joined the rebellion. While the Ionian Greeks and their allies were effective at sparking revolts, they often lacked the resources to sustain them. Cyprus was a case in point. As soon as the Persians arrived, the Ionians there retreated to their ships and abandoned the island after a brief clash with Darius's navy. Persian ground forces then laid siege to the rebellious cities of Cyprus and captured them one by one. Other areas, like the city of Saloy in northern Cyprus, capitulated to the Persians after being held under siege for several months. The Ionian coalition also suffered huge losses as the Persians systematically took back the Greek cities of Asia Minor. In 494 BC, a Persian fleet consisting of some 600 ships headed for Miletus. What was left of the Ionian coalition decided to defend the city by sea with every available ship they could muster, which ended up being 353 triremes. The Milesians themselves were tasked with defending the city on land. Herodotus wrote that the Ionian coalition and their allies gathered their fleet off the coast of Miletus near the island of Lade. When the larger Persian fleet arrived, many Ionian ships, especially those from Samos, fled, leaving the remaining vessels, mainly from Chios, to face the Persian fleet alone. The Chian ships resisted for a time, but eventually were either destroyed or captured by the Persians. The defeat at Lade dealt a decisive blow to the Ionian rebellion, and led to the rapid fall of the remaining rebel cities to Darius's armies. By 493 BC, the revolt had been completely crushed, with all of Ionia and the other rebellious regions of Asia Minor, the Aegean, and Cyprus firmly restored to Persian control. Those who participated in the revolt faced harsh punishments, with Miletus, where the rebellion began, suffering the most. The city and its sacred sanctuary of Didyma were destroyed as punishment for the sacking of Sardis and the destruction of the temple of Cybele several years prior. Many of the city's inhabitants were also killed, with the survivors being relocated to southern Mesopotamia, at least according to Herodotus. He wrote, "The Milesians who had been captured alive were taken to Susa. King Darius inflicted no further harm on them, but settled them on the sea called the Erythraean in the city of Ampec, past which the Tigris River flows and empties into the sea. Of Milesian territory, the Persians kept the regions around the city and plain for themselves, but gave the hill country to the Carians of Padassa." After the fighting ended, Darius sought to restore order and stability to Ionia. His subordinates, including his brother Artaphernes, the satrap of Sardis, recognized that perhaps their backing of unpopular tyrants and arbitrary demands for tribute may have contributed to the unrest that sparked the Ionian uprising. Herodotus tells us, "The Persians caused no further strife with the Ionians that year. Indeed, they instituted some policies that actually served them well. Artaphernes, the governor of Sardis, summoned envoys from the Ionian cities, and through them compelled the Ionians to make compacts with one another so that they would submit their disputes to legal arbitration and refrain from pillaging and plundering one another. Not only did he enforce these procedures, he also measured out their land in parasangs, the Persians' term for distances of 30 stadia, and according to these divisions, he assessed tribute for each district. And Artaphernes' assessments on the basis of land, which did not differ very much from the previous ones, have continued to be observed from that time to my own day." Herodotus also tells us that Darius' son-in-law, Mardonius, replaced the tyrannies in the Ionian cities with democracies. For what Mardonius now did was to depose all the tyrants of the Ionians and establish democracies in their cities. Scholars question the accuracy of this particular claim by Herodotus and suggest it may have been intended to captivate his primarily Athenian audience. During Herodotus' time, Athenian leaders were advocating for democracies across the Greek world, which was in contrast to the more autocratic and oligarchic regimes backed by the Spartans and their allies in the Peloponnesian League. The main point that Herodotus is probably stressing is that the Persians went through great lengths to bring order and stability to Ionia, which probably included greater autonomy and more self-governance. Historians also tend to agree that the Achaemenid government did restore many of the privileges initially granted to the Ionians by Cyrus the Great a few decades earlier. Writing in the 1st century BC, the historian Diodorus Siculus recounts a conversation between Artaphernes, the satrap of Sardis, and Hecataeus of Miletus, in which they discussed how to resolve problems in Ionia. The conversation went something like this. Hecataeus the Milesian, whom the Ionians had sent as their ambassador, asked Artaphernes what grounds he had to mistrust the Ionians. Artaphernes replied that he was sure the Ionians would bear a grudge, having been beaten so badly in the war. "Why surely," said Hecataeus, "if suffering breeds distrust, then it follows that being treated well by the Persians will make our cities well disposed to you." Artaphernes approved of this argument, and so he restored the laws in Ionia and imposed fixed tributes on the cities based on what they could afford. Such reforms appear to have been effective, because after their revolt, the Ionians remained loyal to the Persian crown and even participated in future invasions of Greece, at least until 479 BC. The Ionian rebels had been defeated, and order restored to their cities, but the question remained: what should be done about those who supported the rebellion from afar, specifically Athens and Eretria? Clearly, they had to be punished, or other Greek city-states under Persian rule might be emboldened to incite future revolts across the region. There was also a strong desire for revenge. Sardis had been burned, Persian and Lydian troops killed, and a good deal of property destroyed. Herodotus also tells us that Darius's anger was particularly directed at the Athenians. In Histories, he wrote, "When it was reported to King Darius that Sardis had been captured and burned by the Athenians and Ionians, it is said that he was unconcerned about the Ionians, knowing well that they would not escape retribution for their revolt. But he asked who the Athenians were. When he learned the answer, he called for his bow, nocked an arrow, and shot it into the sky. As the arrow sailed towards the sun, he said, 'O Zeus, may I have my vengeance upon the Athenians.' He then assigned one of his attendants to say to him 3 times, whenever dinner was set before him, 'Sire, remember the Athenians.'" To be continued in Part 2. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to Faria Faraji for bringing life to this project with his amazing original music inspired by different traditions from all over the globe. Definitely check out his channel. There's a link to it in the video description. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, GrandKick69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wenix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypno San, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.